Many people said to me before the March of the Living that it would be a trip of a lifetime. And now I've completed it and I've attempted to digest the intense program, as well as have time to reflect on what it all means. My reply to that statement would now be this. The March of the Living is not a trip of a lifetime, and that's my 12-word summary of the 2 weeks I spent in Poland and Israel, visiting death camps, former ghettos, cemeteries, historically significant landmarks, memorials, statues, museums, and synagogues. Not to mention all the people I met along the way, many of which generously shared their personal stories. The reason why I feel this way will be explained, but first, when we talk about the Shoah, certain words get used like liquidation, persecution, elimination, pogrom, annihilation, cleanse, and of course, the final solution. What all these words do for me is perpetuate a surreal abstraction from the cruel and harsh reality that this was nothing more than the systematic and cold-blooded murder of 6 million Jews. More than 7 million Soviet citizens, over 3 million Polish citizens, 500,000 Serbians, 250,000 people with a disability, 15,000 people who identified as LGBTI, 1 million Romani, Freemasons, Slovenians and Spanish Republicans, and 5,000 Jehovah's Witnesses. An estimated 17 million people. Think about that for a moment, 17 million people. What does that even look like? How does one even begin to understand such a vast number? It's been said that good authors borrow and great authors steal. In fact, I stole those words from Aaron Sorkin, who stole it from another person, who no doubt pinched it from elsewhere. So I wanted to start this presentation by sharing a reflection of one of the fellow marchers, a reflection they had based on an expression. They reminded us one cold morning as we stood on the banks of the Soa River in Oświęcim in Poland, a town more commonly known to people as Auschwitz, that when 1,000 people die, it's a government statistic. But when one person dies, it's a national tragedy. The origin and meaning behind the expression is not important. What is important is our reflection on what it means for how we understand the brutal and methodical murder of 17 million people. What if we were to acknowledge or memorialise each and every Holocaust victim's death as a single and separate day of mourning? How long do you think we'd need to do that? Well, it's not 100 years, it's not 1,000, it's not even 10,000 years. In fact, it would take 46,500 years to memorialise every single soul. But what does that look like? Well, the Titanic is one of the stories we're familiar with and the tragic loss and devastation we associate with it. So repeat that 11,309 times. That's a lot of Leo and Kate. How about Haiti? Back in 2010, they were hit by a natural disaster, one of the greatest of all time, an earthquake killing more than 160,000 people. Now repeat that another 106 times. Surprisingly, I'm going to bring up sport here, but we're a sporting country. Victoria has a proud history with Aussie rules, and so how many AFL grand finals at the MCG is that equivalent to? Well, it would take us up to the year 2188 if we were to equalise those numbers. So imagine that for a moment. It's not easy to do, and certainly it's far too abstract for me to comprehend. So maybe memorialising a day is too long. Perhaps it would be easy if we grasp if we observed a minute's silence. After all, that appears to be the traditional way of honouring lost souls. We stand for a silent minute, heads bowed, deep in reflective contemplation. How long is needed for that? 4,309 years. So what about 1 second per victim? Perhaps this is easy to understand. That would add up to 72 years, which is an entire lifetime for many people, and certainly many more years than most, if not all, in this room have left. However, this was not an ocean liner accident, nor was it a natural disaster, nor was it anywhere near as trivial as a sporting crowd. This was 17 million people brutally killed by Nazis simply because of their country of origin, their religion, their political beliefs, their sexuality, or their disability. And 6 million of those were Jews. The human brain, despite its wondrous capacity, just isn't able to properly compute these vast numbers outside of the abstract. This leaves us struggling with a number like 17 million to conceptualise the extent of the Holocaust in real terms. So instead, let us not remember numbers, demographics, or statistics, but instead let us remember the names. One such name is Jack Meister, another Freddie Hirsch, and another Jan Karski. 3 people with 3 stories. 2 were Jewish, 1 was Catholic, One survived the camps, one did not, and the other tried so hard to save them all. With these three names alone, three names that shaped my March to the Living experience, I think it's more important to understand that behind every single one of the 17 million souls recorded in history is a person with a name, a story, a family, and all of that is forgotten when reflecting on just the large numbers alone. The Jewish ethos mission for me, at least in part, was to build more of an understanding of the Shoah and to better appreciate its impact through the stories of just a couple of people, to bring to life the story of that individual, who they were, what became of them, rather than leave at the end of the trip caught up in the abstraction of vast numbers. To understand this dark period, one must delve into the stories, the witness accounts and first-hand testimonies. One must listen to individual experiences to truly understand the epic tragedy that took place. But before I speak about Jack and Jan and Freddie, I want to tell you about 22 others. Frost has already mentioned them briefly. 22 Polish Jews whose story was introduced to us at the very start of our trip. 22 Jews from Policia that stand out for me as the moment of the trip that set the tone for the rest of the 2 weeks. 22 Polish Jews that were brought to a town square one dark night by the Gestapo, marched at gunpoint a kilometre or so out of town, unceremoniously shot in cold blood, and then dumped in an unmarked grave in what was literally a small field off a lonely road. Why speak about these 22 souls? Because it's not 17 million, and it's not 6 million, and we can better perhaps comprehend the extent of the overall devastation through these 22 people. 22 people for no other reason than who they were, not for crimes committed or acts of war perpetrated or in the throes of combat, but simply because of who they were born to be, were murdered and left for decades without anybody knowing where they were or being afforded their right to have Kaddish said at their grave. We were humbled to have been invited to drive up to Policia, joining townsfolk, school students, the mayor and local officials as they marched with the great-grandson of one of those 22. From the town square through a small street in this sleepy community to what was quite literally a tiny field behind someone's house. It is there that these 22 souls, whose grave was only discovered about 2 years ago and now memorialised by a large headstone marking and honouring their final resting place. This inaugural march of about 120 people, including us Aussies, marked the occasion with speeches and songs to honour those 22, as well as the recital of Kaddish finally setting their memory. And now from 17 million to 6 million to 22 souls, onto those 3 names. The first, Jack. A survivor of 4 Nazi camps and a death march from to Buchenwald, we had the absolute honour of Jack being a part of the tour. Despite being a man of very few words, although he does wear a cheeky grin, Jack did share his Holocaust testimony with us whilst on the grounds of Birkenau, merely metres away from the gas chambers and crematoria. This was the second time Jack had returned to the wretched place since the war. The first time was also on the March of the Living just a couple of years ago. In fact, many survivors return. It's a pilgrimage for many. The very nature of arriving and leaving on their terms, not somebody else's, I think acts as a symbolic gesture to show the world and themselves the Nazis did not win the war. They themselves survived this horrifying place where many did not, and that they still have their freedom. I guess it's like a defiant and cathartic middle finger to the Third Reich, saying, we survived, you didn't, we are still here, where are you? Jack was about 11 when the Nazi occupation of Poland began. Let that sink in just for a moment. He was 11 years old. A time when a young Jewish boy should be playing in the streets with friends, furthering his education, perhaps beginning to prepare for his bar mitzvah, and generally just enjoying his young innocence. He was living with his family in Kelsey when Nazi soldiers first stormed his hometown, until then a safe haven as you'd expect. Kelsey's about halfway between Warsaw and Krakow, and this was no shtetl. This is a decent-sized city of about 75,000 with about 18,000 Jews. Ironically, one of the few Polish cities that increased its population of Jews after Nazi occupation, as 7,000 or so were deported from other towns and villages from across Poland into the newly formed Kelsey ghetto. As you'd imagine, life in the ghetto was bleak. 26,000 people crammed into just a few blocks. Conditions were miserable, food supply was short, and epidemic typhus killed 4,000 people in less than 12 months. So here was Jack, along with his family, now living inside the ghetto. He was young, he was healthy, so he was sent into forced labour, spending days at a time outside of the ghetto in Nazi factories. So just 12 years old now, this was the end of Jack's childhood. His friendships, his education, his bar mitzvah, and for several years, any semblance of freedom or certainty of survival. Again, he was just 12 years old at that time. The ghetto had only been operating for about a year when Jack returned from a few days away at the factory. During that time he was away, the entire Kelsey ghetto had been liquidated. Records from the time show that those that weren't able to move, including the sick, the elderly, and people with a disability, were killed on the spot. Think about that just for a moment. That would almost be every single person we support at Jewish Care. Those that could move were transported to Treblinka. Jack returned to discover his entire family was gone and no word as to their fate. Something to this day, despite years of trying, he's been unable to get closure on. Stripped of his family, Jack was transported to Radom labour camp, where he worked for about a year before being transported to Auschwitz. It was in Auschwitz where Jack lost his name and became B488, as assigned to him on the tattoo he was given upon arrival. Not long after arriving, he was transported again, this time to Buna, a satellite labour camp of Auschwitz. Still just a young teenager, he remained at Buna until the end of 1944, when he began the long march to Buchenwald. This was a death march. This death march was made up of thousands of people, covering about 700 kilometres in weather that reached minus 20 degrees. And with reports saying that about 1 in 4 died along the way. It wouldn't be until April of 1945, with Jack now around 15 or 16, but still barely a child, that he'd be liberated from Buchenwald by American soldiers. Jack fondly recalls the American soldier that first greeted him, offering him a piece of chocolate and asking to take his photo, promising he would return to give Jack a copy. Here's Jack holding that photo. I couldn't help but think of Jack each night of the march as I would lay in bed, trying to digest everything seen and heard that day, sometimes angry, sometimes baffled, sometimes humbled, most often in tears. What is it that Jack is thinking of right now as he goes to sleep? What are other survivors around the world kept awake thinking at night? What wakes Jack up at night? What gives him cold sweats? What parts of Jack's life does he try to forget? What parts won't he tell others? And how is it, after all that Jack has seen and endured, can he still wear a smile at all? And what went wrong with humanity for all this to have happened to our ever so sweet Jack? The second name is Jan Karski, a Polish Roman Catholic from the city of Łódź, a resistance movement soldier that was honoured in 1982 as one of the righteous among the nations. At a time where the world had almost a total moral collapse, there was a small minority of people who mustered extraordinary courage to uphold basic human values. The honorific of Righteous Among the Nations is issued by the State of Israel and administered by Yad Vashem to describe non-Jewish people who risked their lives during the Holocaust to save Jews. As an emissary and courier of the Polish secret state, Jan presented his famous Karski report on the mass extermination taking place in Poland to the governments of the Allied powers. He performed a number of secret missions, one of which was to report his observations of the atrocities to the Prime Minister of the Polish government in exile. His intelligence was all gathered firsthand. In a series of covert visits where Jewish underground leaders would smuggle him to the Warsaw Ghetto to observe what was happening to Polish Jews. Of one such visit, Karski said this: "My job was just to walk and observe and remember the odour, the children, dirty, lying. I saw a man standing with blank eyes. I asked the guide, 'What is he doing?' The guide whispered, 'He's just dying.' I remember degradation, starvation, and dead bodies lying on the street. We were walking the streets and my guide kept repeating, 'Look at it, remember, remember.' And I did remember. The dirty streets, the stench, everywhere, suffocating, nervousness." The list of Karski's attempts to change the course of history and to end mass killings of innocents is as long as it is heroic and daring. It's certainly worth spending some time researching his story. In an interview just a few years before his death in 2000, Karski said this about those that stood back and did nothing to save people during World War II. "It was easy for the Nazis to kill Jews because they did. The Allies considered it impossible and too costly to rescue the Jews. The Jews were abandoned by all governments, church hierarchies and societies, but thousands of Jews survived because thousands of individuals from Poland, France, Belgium, Denmark, Holland helped to save them. Now every government and church says, we tried to help the Jews because they are ashamed of doing nothing and want to keep their reputations. They didn't help because 6 million Jews perished. No one did enough. And finally, the last name, Freddie Hirsch. A Jew that was sent to Titanic, I've butchered that name, I'm sorry, a hybrid concentration camp and ghetto established by the SS in what is now the Czech Republic, and then ultimately transported to Auschwitz. These images you see on the screen are facsimiles of original drawings made by children in concentration camps and are currently drawn directly on the walls of Block 27 at Auschwitz under the exhibition name Traces of Life, The World of Children. Many of these images drawn on the walls of barracks and buildings in Theresienstadt and Auschwitz were made possible by Freddie Hirsch. Freddie was a German-born man, he was Jewish, and he was openly gay. And he was one of the reasons so many children survived the horrors of the Holocaust. The 2016 documentary Heaven in Auschwitz tells the incredible story of 13 survivors in particular, now mostly in their 80s and 90s, but back then mere children. They found this legendary character Freddy, who they say changed their lives forever. When World War II broke out, these young people had their childhood shattered as they were sent off to ghettos and camps. There wasn't much that could break them free from their physical confines, but Freddie did all he could to protect them against the brutality and ruthlessness of these places through art, music and sport. Able to convince SS guards to supply him with drawing materials, some books and the occasional musical instrument, just so that children could be distracted each day. Many of these children, and hence the title of the documentary, claim that even in hell there was a heaven, thanks to Freddie. Another documentary, Dear Freddy, is an animated film that screened at the 2018 Jewish Film Festival here in Melbourne. This combination of interviews, photographs, some archival footage and animated recreations tell Freddy's story in fascinating detail. Painting a picture of an untold hero of World War II, an openly gay Jew that was able to work the system so that children could be spared or at least sheltered from the horror. So what did Freddy do exactly? Well, late in 1943, Barrack 31 in Birkenau was converted by Freddy from a horse barn into a children's day camp. Yep, that's right. Freddy ran a children's recreation camp inside a death camp. Under his supervision, dozens of children worked together whitewashing the walls and painting over them various scenes from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Little Red Riding Hood. On the posts meant to tether horses, he hung small sculptures from tins and little Greek and Roman figures. Folk songs, Beethoven's Ninth, Frere Jacques could all be heard inside. In this playhouse, just 100 metres from the gas chambers, there was even a small library, where of course every book was contraband. There were chairs and a table fashioned out of upended boxes. Author Daniel Goldhagen describes ordinary Germans zealously killing Jews, and that's his whole point basically, that genocide was sadly a popular movement. The resistance likewise was also a movement, although less popular. Some Jews and righteous Gentiles hid and balked and refused to be killed or killed, but Freddie Hirsch didn't play that end game. And that may be why he's remembered in the way that makes people gasp. He acknowledged Auschwitz and Terezin and Nazi-dominated Prague. He lived in each of those places and systematically attempted to abolish them daily in tiny ways. What Freddie created at Auschwitz was really a footnote to the worlds he created in Terezin and wartime Prague. Auschwitz was a 6-month sentence appended onto the 2.5 years he spent organising children's activities in the Czech transport camp and the 4 years he spent prior to that in Prague as a sports instructor for Jewish children banned from public schools and local parks. Freddie came into the concentration camp the same way every Jew got there, on train. Sadly, like so many others, he never left Birkenau. Whilst Freddie could not save the 1.5 million children that were killed during the Holocaust, nor could he give them back their innocence, many survivors of both these camps remember fondly their experience with this remarkable man who sought to share hope and humanity in a hopeless and inhumane place. From the darkness of the clouds in Poland to the brightness of the sun in Israel, I want to mention just 3 standout moments in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The photo you now see was taken right in the heart of Tel Aviv on our first day there. A welcoming, social, vibrant city with a richness of diversity. In fact, it's so rich in its diversity and inclusivity that a recent survey showed that 1/4 of Tel Aviv's 400,000 residents identify as LGBTI. and that's more than 2.5 times the average across the Western world. So it's no surprise that Eurovision was there this year. That's not one of my 3 standout moments, but perhaps a close 4th or 5th. What is a surprise, despite or perhaps in spite of all of Tel Aviv's acceptance and inclusiveness, is that anti-Semitism is still present in 2019. Look again at the blue arrows in this photo. See the remnants of the spray-painted swastikas? Attempts to remove them were enough for me not to notice until it was pointed out by our guides. But that's beside the point, because regrettably, despite coming up to 75 years since the fall of the Third Reich, the swastika and the hate it represents is still an ever-present concern. Israel, for me, in the face of the previous week's immersion in Poland and the remnants of hatred and destruction during Nazi occupation, was restorative in many respects. And these are the 3 moments why. Not being Jewish or religious, visiting Israel was always going to be quite different to the experience of many others on the trip. Seeing the old city and the kotel and experiencing Shabbat there still had meaning for me for different reasons. And so in spite of a week of Holocaust education and the witnessing of what happens when the world fails people, I had my faith restored in humanity 3 times over. I've told a few people this story already, but on this Shabbat in Jerusalem, myself, Frost, and one other were called aside by one of the group leaders. Me being me thought we were in trouble, but then I looked to my right and my left and realised these 2 wouldn't be in trouble, so it was going to be okay. And the leader, Julian, took us aside, and knowing that we weren't going to be getting the exact same experience with a Shabbat at the kotel as the others in our group, wanted to take us to a special place in the old city, a place that he described as his favourite view in the city. He didn't have to do this. This was not a part of the program. This was something that he just recognised would make someone's day better. So he took us to this wall here and held us there for a moment, explaining what he was doing, that this was his favourite place, that this is kind of the favourite time of the day because of the lights, and then stepped us around the corner for us to see that, a magnificent view in the old city. And it's people like Julian that restore my faith in humanity. The second moment was listening to 2 inspiring women, Vada Selig and Asha Al-Khatib, from the Parent Circle. The Parent Circle is a joint Israeli-Palestinian organisation of over 600 families, all of whom have lost an immediate family member to the ongoing conflict in the region. They believe that a process of reconciliation between nations is a prerequisite to achieving a sustainable peace, and so they spread their message through education programs, public meetings, and the media. The aim is to prevent bereavement, to promote dialogue, tolerance, reconciliation, and peace. Vada and Isha visit each other's homes regularly at great personal risk. Their stories are driven by obligation, empathy, passion, and sheer chutzpah. It's people like Vada and Isha that restore my faith in humanity. And wow, what can I say about this 3rd and final moment? Visiting Save a Child's Heart was in fact the very last programmed activity for the entire model trip. And gee, was it a perfect way to close out the 2 weeks. For me, group fatigue had set in, the weight of trying to digest the magnitude of death and dying was overwhelming, and just late nights and early starts contributed to the general exhaustion. And then this happened. The super cute little Ali from Uganda. Ali was at Save a Child's Heart for life-saving surgery, provided at no cost to her family by brilliant Israeli surgeons, nurses and clinicians. All the while being housed and supported with her mum by a great team of home staff. Save a Child's Heart, based just outside of Tel Aviv, have just recently saved their 5,000th child by offering this remarkable free service of life-saving and life-changing heart surgery. Their mantra is, we mend hearts regardless of religion, gender or nationality. Something simply not available to so many people in third world and developing countries, just like Abdullah from Zanzibar in this picture. Save a Child's Heart also trains teams of surgeons and nurses in some of the countries they work in, so that they can continue this vital work in a more sustainable manner. It's organisations like Save a Child's Heart that restore my faith in humanity. Now to come back to my opening statement. Was March of the Living a trip of a lifetime for me? No, it wasn't. This 2-week incredibly intense program wasn't even close to what is needed to fully honour those that were lost, not to mention the many millions more that were affected. What was the March of the Living for me then? It was, hopefully, the start of a lifetime commitment of honouring those lost every minute of every day. I don't necessarily have 72 years left in my life to offer a minute to each of the souls, But I hope that as a result of this personal and physical journey, I can look back on my own final days and say that I've lived a life that honours all fellow human beings. That I stood up when people were being oppressed, belittled or victimised, and that I did not sit idly by as those in positions of power or privilege sought to strip others of their dignity or freedom. That others look back and perhaps had their faith restored in humanity through something I said or something I did. So March of the Living is not a trip of a lifetime. Unfortunately, I'll quote Cedric here, it's a trip for a lifetime. We are all beholden to not only remember the victims and their families, along with the survivors and their families, but also the righteous among the nations, to ensure that we live a life that serves their memory well and honours the efforts they made to defend, protect and save others, to be an upstander, to speak up and speak out against discrimination, injustice, cruelty and persecution, to live a life that honours names like Jack Meister and Jan Karski and Freddie Hirsch. When visiting Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Centre in Jerusalem, you are immediately confronted by two questions. What is it to be a human being, and what type of human being are you? And so whether you have been on the March of the Living, hope to go on the March of the Living, or have no plans to take the trip at all, they are worthy questions for us all to ask ourselves. And as you do reflect on those questions, please remember the names and not the numbers. Thank you.